The Wheel on the School, Chapter 5, Pier and Dirk and the Cherry Tree. It seemed that even two different roads couldn't separate Pier and Dirk. They dutifully started out on the separate roads the teacher had assigned them. Dirk had taken the main road to the south that led to the village of Turnad. Pier had a little dirt road that angled and curved its unhurried way southwest from Shora. There were but 4 farms along the little road. Pier visited each farm, but it was for nothing. Even farmers, it seemed, did not keep spare wagon wheels. "All my wheels are under my wagon," the last farmer told Pier, "and that's where I need them. I can't think of anything much more useless than a wagon without wheels, except maybe a man without legs." That was the last farm. After that, the little dirt road went in a long, lazy loop and suddenly ended up in the Turnad road that Dirk had taken. Pier settled himself in the grass. He'd wait for Dirk. Dirk couldn't possibly be past this point because there were a lot of houses and farms along the Turnad road. Pier sat a long time in the quiet. He wondered idly if the farmer who had said that about men without legs being useless had been thinking about legless Janice. Wonder if he knows Janice, Pier thought out loud. It must be awful not to have one leg. A shark had bitten off both of Janice's legs in one bite. That was when Janice had still been a fisherman, like the rest of the men of Shora. He'd been knocked overboard one day, and just like that, a shark had come along and bitten off both of Janice's legs, boots and all. Well, Pier made a wide jawing, biting motion with his teeth. When he closed his mouth, he could hear his teeth snap in the silence. He felt along the edges of his teeth. Man, one bite, boots and all? Now Janice just sat in a wheelchair in his house or yard, and he'd become mean, the meanest man in Shora. Pier suddenly leaned forward and made a cutting motion with the edge of his hand across his legs. He tried to imagine what it would be like to be without any legs. It sure wouldn't be any fun. It would make him mean too. Hey, that was a crazy thing to think about, sitting here all by himself. It was so quiet here. He stared at his legs. Just thinking crazy things like that seemed to make his legs feel numb and dead. But maybe it was because he'd been sitting in one position too long. He hastily changed and sat cross-legged, glad he could double his legs under him. Why, sitting that way made him look almost legless. In a scary sort of way, he was enjoying the numb feeling in his legs which he imagined had been cut off. He looked around him in the stillness. How was he going to get home? He was legless. He pictured himself crawling along the winding dirt road, his stumps of legs dragging behind him. He moaned. He hastily tried to make it a little laugh, but it sounded like a groan in the deep country silence. "Hey, cut it out," he told himself. Well, that was the trouble with him when he was all alone without Dirk. He always thought up scary, silly, hopeless things. He pulled his legs up from under him. One leg still prickled with little needle stabs all the way up. He poked the leg with his finger, jabbed all along it to see if it felt dead all over. He was so engrossed in his lonely little game, he did not see Dirk come stealing toward him through the grass at the edge of the road. Suddenly, Dirk's shadow fell across Pierre's legs. Pier, startled, jerked his head up and glared at Dick. "I suppose you call that hunting for a wagon wheel?" Dirk said. "Well, I don't see you carting any wheels around," Pier told his brother coldly. Dirk had scared him so bad. "No, at least I'm looking, not sitting in the grass." Pier caught himself saying, "Well, you wouldn't look very far either if you had no legs." "Huh?" Dirk said. Pier hastily changed the subject. "Well, I finished my road. This is your road. So you just go on and finish yours, and I'll wait here for you." "Boy, I like that," Dirk exploded. "Wait here. Do you realize this road goes clear to Turnad? Well, maybe they've got some nice wheels in Turnad." Pier was paying Dirk back for scaring him, but he was secretly relieved that Dirk was there. When he was with Dirk, he never got crazy, silly notions like having no legs. He certainly had no intention of sitting here alone again, waiting for Dirk. So he jumped up. "I'll go with you, Dirk." The next moment he crumpled to the ground. "Dirk! My legs!" he gasped. "My legs! They won't hold me!" "Come on. They've gone to sleep because you've been sitting on them all afternoon," Dirk said impatiently. "Oh, yes, that's it," Pier said in relief. "Oh, but that had scared him for a moment. You know," he told Dirk, "for a moment there, I thought I didn't have any legs." "You've got plenty legs," Dirk said, "just no sense." "Oh, is that so?" Pier said hotly, but then he grinned. "Man, Dirk, I'm glad you came along. I don't like to go down roads and do things alone." "I don't either," Dirk said. "But come on, let's get going." "Wait a tornad?" Pierre asked. "We won't get back till after dark. And I got hungry sitting here. I didn't eat much at noon. I was too excited. Let's run home and ask Mom for something to eat." Dirk wavered. "All right," he agreed. "I'm hungry too. But we'll run all the way home and then all the way back here. And then we'll go clear to Ternad if we have to. And we won't fool around." Side by side they ran all the way back to Shora. In the village street they finally slowed to a panting walk. The street lay empty and quiet. There wasn't a sound anywhere. Nothing stirred. "Everybody's out in the country hunting," Dirk said guiltily. "But you had to go and get hungry." "Well, you said you were hungry too." "Yes, but not until you reminded me of it." Suddenly the silence in the village was shattered. There was a horrific banging and rattling and clatter of metal. Then the noise stopped. There was a moment's quiet. Then there came a savage, smashing sound. Dirk and Pier looked at each other and grinned. "He missed," Dirk said with satisfaction. "Boy, did you hear that rock hit the fence? If he had hit that bird, there wouldn't be a feather left." "Wow," Pier said. They stood in the street listening and grinning, waiting for more. They knew only too well what was happening. It was Janice. The cherries on Janice's tree must be beginning to ripen, and the birds were raiding it. But, as in every other spring, Janice was under the tree protecting his cherries. Janice's wife, had to climb up in the cherry tree every spring to hang a long rope, with pieces of tin strung on it, from the highest bough that would hold her weight. Janice couldn't do that. He had no legs. From the first day the cherries began to turn, Janice sat in his wheelchair under the tree to yank the rope and rattle the tin whenever a bird came near. The rattling tin took care of most birds, but not the magpies. Magpies were bold enough and clever enough to raid the tree and steal a cherry in spite of all the rattling and banging and clatter. For magpies and boys, Janice had other measures. A little pile of stones always lay nearby, ready for the grabbing, beside his wheelchair. That was for magpies and boys. Janice had a high board fence around his little yard. The top of this fence was studded with nails and sharp, jagged, broken necks of bottles. But in spite of nails and glass, the cherry tree was a terrible temptation to the boys in bare Shora. Janice's cherry tree was the only fruit tree in Shora, in the middle of the whole sea country around. In Shora, a boy or a bird seldom got fruit. That's why Janice lived under his tree in the springtime. Janice started to stand guard long before the cherries were ripe, for even a green cherry was a temptation to birds and boys, a green cherry being better than no cherry at all. But if the fence with its broken glass and nails failed to keep the boys out, there was a pile of stones gathered for Janice by his wife. On the way home from peddling her bread in the countryside, Jana had to fill up the bottom of her breadbasket with stones gathered along the gravel roads. Every evening she supplied Janice with another day's ammunition, and Janice did not hesitate to hurl a stone at a boy trying to painfully worm himself over the fence without cutting himself and tearing up his clothes. At boy or bird, Janice let fly a stone, and through the years, his aim had become deadly. Even Big Jella had failed, as often as he'd tried. If Jella couldn't manage it, who could? Jella often told how once he got over the fence and only one long rip in his breeches. He dropped down inside Janice's yard and for once hadn't been noticed. Janice had been asleep under the cherry tree. On tiptoes, Jella had gone toward the cherry tree and Janice. But just then, a miserable magpie had screeched in the tree, and all in one moment it seemed. Even before the screech was out of the silly bird's mouth, Janice had been wide awake. For a moment, Janice and Jella had stared at each other. Then Jella had turned and raced for the back fence. He'd wildly thrown himself up against it, so scared he'd been, and Janice in his wheelchair had silently chased him. You wouldn't believe it, Jella said every time he told about it. But him without legs, chasing me in a wheelchair in that boarded-up yard, and never saying a word, I just stood up against that fence and let him grab me. I was paralyzed. What had happened then? Even now, after a year, Jella didn't want to talk much about it. But it seems Janice had taken Jella and flung him over his legless stumps, and then he had gone to work. All Jella would really say was, I wasn't scared paralyzed anymore when he got through with me. I just couldn't walk. That man's got the hardest hands, and he never said a word. Well, Jella never tried again. Back in the fenced-in yard, the tin began rattling and clattering once more. Come on, Dirk said. We've got to get going. But Pier stood staring at the high fence back of which Janice was sitting. He didn't seem to hear Dirk. He stared. He stood in a half stoop, absent-mindedly rubbing his hand along his leg, and stared. Do you know what, Dirk? He said suddenly. Teacher said to look everywhere, didn't he? Well, one thing's sure. Nobody looked in Janice's yard. Suppose Janice had a wheel. Nobody knows what's in that yard. Just suppose that there's a wheel there. Well, how would you get in there if there was? How would you even get in his yard to look? Dirk said. But he was interested now and stood looking from his scheming brother to the high fence. If Jella couldn't do it, how do you think you're going to do it? Yes, but Jella was alone. We're two. We'd do it together. How? Well, you'd have to climb the fence way back at the back. And get my head knocked off with a rock, Dirk said. No thanks. No, you wouldn't climb over the fence. You'd make a lot of noise, as if you were climbing the fence, but you wouldn't get your head above it, see? Then when Janice heard you, he'd most likely wheel himself to the back fence and wait for you to come over so he could sock you with a rock. But if you make a lot of noise and keep climbing as if you can't make it, Janice won't hear me open the gate to his backyard. Then I can quickly sneak in and take a look around, and even grab a few cherries maybe, see? He won't be near his pile of rocks. He'll be waiting for you at the fence. And if he does turn and see me, I'll just run back out the gate. You'll run if you don't get paralyzed like Jella. I won't get paralyzed, because sitting there in the country waiting for you, I kind of figured out how it feels without legs, and how mean it must make you feel and everything, and Pier gave up trying to explain. He didn't have the right words for it. It was impossible to explain, even to Dirk. Dirk was looking at him. Well, that is a plan, he grudgingly admitted. Well, if you dare, I dare. Then Dirk started for the back fence.